Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Cathedra webinar. We're coming to you live on January 23rd. For those of you who don't already know, Cathedra means learning in Creek. And today we're going to be learning about Federal Grants 201, how to feel confident as you click submit from Diane Leonard. My name's Brooke Warrington. I'm the Training and Development Specialist here at the Native Learning Center. We're all really excited that you could be with us here today. If you could follow along as I read the disclaimer aloud. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. Also displayed here is our copyright infringement law. This is just a friendly reminder that the webinar presentation materials are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws. Before we get started, I want you to know how some of the features work and how the environment is. So if you look at the top of your screen, you'll see an icon of either a person with their hand raised or you just see a hand. Know that with that icon, you can either raise your hand, you could signal that you agree, signal that you disagree, or let us know that you're stepping away. Now your screen should look similar to this graphic here. To the bottom left, you'll see a box that says Files. Here you'll find a copy of today's presentation. If you want a copy to download for yourself, just click on the item you want to download, then click the arrow pointing downwards to save it onto your device. Once the item's downloaded, it'll appear in your device's download section. The next box over is labeled Web Links. This is where you'll find our survey about today's webinar, along with the link to join our email list and any other links that are maybe seen throughout today's presentation. And then over to the right, we have our chat box available. This is how you'll communicate with the instructor and the NLC staff. So if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to interact by using the chat box. Just type your message and hit enter, or click the up arrow icon button to submit. We do encourage class participation, so feel free to write in those questions or comments. And know that any tech support issues could be included there as well. Know that most of our tech support issues could be solved by just exiting and re-entering the meeting room. But then, of course, if you're encountering any further difficulties, just let me know in the chat box. Let's go ahead and all try out the chat together now. Go ahead and let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and your tribal affiliation, please. And while you guys are introducing yourselves in the chat box, Diane, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thanks so much, Brooke. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for taking time out of your day to join me for Federal Grants 201, How to Feel Confident as You Click Submit. I am so excited to be back with you again. I see some names in the participant list that I recognize from previous grant writing webinars. Great to see you again. And I see that some of you are already warming up the chat box following Brooke's prompt to let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and your tribal affiliation. As we're getting started, I do recognize some of the names, but not all. And so a quick introduction to me and my background. I'm joining you today from the Thousand Islands, which is in far upstate New York, right along the Canadian border. And, well, I love all things grants. That's the reality. I have been in the grant-related field my entire professional career. I actually started as a grant maker, working as the program officer for a statewide public foundation, so making grants, but I've been on the grant seeking side for more than 20 years and in business for, if I can believe it, 19 years as of this upcoming weekend. And one of the things that makes me so excited about the work that my team and I do is that it's not only training and supporting your capacity building efforts like today, but we're also supporting writing efforts for our clients. And to date, that's more than $121 million in competitive grant awards. So what that means is a lot of writing, a lot of clicking submit, a lot of probably self-doubt along the way while clicking submit. And so today is not just theoretical grant writing work, but really tactical. This is the work that my team and I are doing literally every day. And I think what you'll find is while it is Federal Grants 201, some of the skills we're going to be talking about today will apply to all of the grants that you might consider, whether you're looking at state, county, city, or foundation. So today we're going to talk first about needs statements. We're also going to take a look at SMART objectives and how we can use those to position our application to most strongly align with the guidelines that have been released. We're going to talk about our application structure. Federal grants give us the opportunity to control our formatting, unlike many online portal submissions we experience, especially in the foundation space. And then we will talk about how, before we click submit, can we ensure that our application is as competitive as possible. Now, that competition piece, that is our theme throughout today's session. But before we dive in, I do want to add one bit to the housekeeping. So the session does have the slides in the file download. Welcome you to grab those because we have a fair amount of slides, and some of them are going to be examples that you might want to reference back to, things that we're going to Monday quarterback and learn from. So I wanted to highlight that those are there for you. And also, I'd love to highlight that I really encourage you to use the chat box and ask questions at any time. Please don't feel like you have to hold them until the end. And one last bit is that I really like to try and check in with you, your understanding, your background, or experience with a particular topic. And so there will be times that I will ask for maybe a reaction using the software tool or asking for your participation in chat. That certainly is not required, but always appreciated if you've got something you want to share or are willing to participate in. So how did I decide on what we would fit in to Federal Grants 201? We've moved past the basics. We are not looking for a federal grant to apply for. We're not talking about registering for the federal portals. We cover that in our Federal Grants 101 level type courses. Really what we're saying in this session today is what are the things that we can fine tune as we get a few federal grants or maybe a dozen or more federal grants under our belt? What is it that we can strengthen? How can we make our applications stronger? And it never, ever, I think, gets easy to click submit on a federal grant. On some level, there is always something about it that will feel like there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of zeros involved in what we're talking about. But what can we do to make us feel more confident and ready to click submit? That's really the challenge that I'm trying to tackle for you and with you today as we look at the content. Now, I know for some of you, you've shared in the chat box, where is it you're joining us from? But what I don't know about anyone on the line is how many federal grant applications have you been a part of? There is no judgment in this answer, whether it is 0, 5, 15. If you could let me know in the chat box how many federal grant applications you have been a part of. Doesn't mean that you have to have led it, that you have to have done all the writing work, but if you could let me know how many you have been a part of, that would be really helpful. Okay, for many of you, it looks like you're going to be considering your very first federal application. Wow, 17 in 2 years. That's a heavy volume. That is a lot, Jason. Sally has 2, but again, I see a number of you are just thinking about submitting that first federal grant. Well, all experience so very welcome. And for those of you that have submitted a few or more, your experience and having you share that in the chat box, I think would really build and support the learning environment today. So I strongly encourage that. Now, part of how we decided on the content for today is by looking at where are organizations frequently losing points within their process, within their federal application that they've submitted. And so I want to start by looking at the needs statement. Often this is the beginning or towards the beginning of a narrative upload that you would be submitting as part of a federal grant. And the reason that I want to put that forward as our first topic for today is because what you're doing is setting the stage with the reviewer for their understanding of what you're going to put forward. The reviewers for a federal grant are always more than dangerously knowledgeable about the topic that they have been asked to review, but they are not even close to knowledgeable about you and your organization and the great work that you do and the specific community where you are proposing to do that work. So you are helping them to understand that you're experts in what you do and the community you serve from the time that you start crafting your need statement. The need statement is going to help the reviewer understand not just that there's a problem or an issue in the country that is trying to be solved, but specifically, what does this scenario look like in your community? One of the ways that I like to think about it, there aren't a lot of formulas that we can use in grant writing, and this is a pretty generic and high level formula. But one of the ways that I like to think about it is that in the need statement, what we're setting out is this problem, the idea in this lime green circle on the left-hand side of this visual equation. We are going to, in our need statement, help our reviewers to understand the problem in our specific community. Where then later on in our proposal, we're going to describe what is the action we're going to take? What are the activities that we're going to implement with the funding so that we go through our equal sign to that purple solution. What is going to happen as a result? What do we expect will change, be better? What will be the impact that we create? So this lime green circle of our problem statement is where we're going to start our conversation. And to do that, I want you to think about what is the one main issue that you would want to address as part of this proposal. What is it that you want your reviewers to remember? So we're going to look at 4 steps that can help us accomplish that as we think about our reviewers, who again are dangerously knowledgeable about the broad topic, but not about our community and our unique needs. So, whether you're thinking about proposals related to health or to education, to workforce development, I'm guessing we've got a wide range of areas that you're thinking about applying for grants in. These steps listed on the screen, we're going to look at each one in detail. These steps can remain the same regardless of which focus area you're going to be applying for funding from. The idea that we want to have one main point, one issue that we're trying to have our reviewers wrap their review around, what think about as their main point, their understanding. Um, there is going to be a lot of information, a lot of data that we could convey to them. But what do we want them to walk away from our proposal with? What would we want them to say to maybe another reviewer? Or if they were talking to a family or a friend in the evening and they were saying, wow, did you know, fill in the blank? What would be the thing that you would want them to remember, the thing that you would want them to say to another reviewer or someone else? What is it that they are supposed to remember out of all the things you have just shared in the need statement? What is the most important thing that you would want them to remember? Now, how do we do that? We do that with a lot of data, maybe your own data. Maybe we use some regional, some national data to give it some context. But one of the things that well-intentioned, awesome organizations will do in federal grants is put in too much data. It almost feels like throwing in everything but the kitchen sink in terms of how much information they will try to fit into the need statement to prove their expertise of their community and the topic at hand. So, to help us understand this, I actually have a bit of a visual game that we're going to play. Visual exercise, we'll say. And it might feel something like what, if you've ever watched the Brain Games TV show, it used to be on cable. I think it might be on Netflix now. If you've ever participated in anything like that, it is going to be a quick little game. Maybe you're going to wonder if your eyes are playing some tricks on you, but what I want to know is which of the 3 images that are about to appear on your screen is the clearest to you. There is no right or wrong answer. You will see 3 numbered images on the screen. And what I would ask you to do is to please type the number into the chat box for the image that is clearest to you. Okay, here we go. There are 3 images on the screen. Which of the images is clearest to you? Please go ahead and let me know in the chat box 1, 2, or 3. All right, we have a number of folks who have let us know which of the images is clearest to them. And no surprise, I never know exactly how it will break out, but I'm usually pretty accurate that we are not going to be unanimous. And that is true again today. So, what are the three images? You're right, they're all butterflies. But for some of you, butterfly number 2, with its outline of the wings, a little bit of a clue with the body and the antennas. For others, though, you saw 3 to be the clearest. Having the ovals in the spots for the top and the bottom of the wings helped to make that butterfly really obvious to you. Now, no one, at least this time, selected number 1. Every once in a while, someone will pick that number 1 is clearest for them. But today, nope, no one saw that. Now, what does this butterfly exercise teach us about writing federal grants that would be highly competitive and feeling confident as we're going to click submit? What you have just demonstrated for the entire group is that we see things differently based on our own perspectives, based on what helps us to navigate through what we're digesting, whether it be a visual or be it text. So the fact that we've got 2 butterflies that engaged across the group helps us to understand that, well, one might be overly complicated. There might be too many dots. And until we would finish the dot to dot work, it would be really difficult to see all the detail of the butterfly. It would take us a lot of work. Maybe to make that grant analogy back, maybe it's going to take the reviewer a full new cup of coffee to understand all the data you've put forward. But our butterfly number 2 and our butterfly number 3 have given some clear outlines about our position so that the reviewer can understand, oh, all right, I didn't have to go digging. I didn't have to get out my pen and do all the dot to dot work. I can see that this is a butterfly, even if I don't necessarily understand all the colors or the differences between the two. I've got a pretty good understanding. Well, let's bring it back from our butterflies. Let's think about this idea of one main issue. You are trying to ensure that your reviewers see the butterfly. Okay, you're right. You're likely not writing about a butterfly. What they're trying to understand is what is happening in your community. You want them to have, your reviewers, the clearest understanding of the issue in your community. It would be one thing if you were applying for a teenage pregnancy prevention program. They might understand as reviewers the national data. Maybe they even understand the state that they are in. But very high odds that they don't know the data and the situation in your community. If we were talking about the rates for diabetes in a community, same thing. A reviewer might have clear understanding of what that looks like if we're talking about national trends. Maybe they'll understand their state or their local community, but very unlikely that they're going to understand your own community. So when you're trying to decide what is it that I want the reviewers to understand, I want you to first look at the data that's available to you. Think about what you already have right at your fingertips. And what we want to think about is how we're going to give that context for our reviewers. We might want to think about giving context to other regions. We might want to give context at the state level or at the national level. When we're thinking about the data that we're going to use, what would be really helpful for me to understand is let's try to narrow our conversation and narrow your focus today to think about one particular topic area. If you were to write a federal grant today, what would be the focus area of your grant? Would it be health? Would it be education? Would it be workforce development? Let me know in a broad phrase, what would be the focus of your work today? If you want to share that in the chat box, that would be fantastic. I don't want to make any assumptions about what sort of focus area you might have for an upcoming federal grant. While you're typing in your focus area, I'm going to give a slightly different, no, actually, it's definitely a different analogy, but we're going to go in a slightly different direction. Yes, pun intended in that moment. As we think about our reviewers who are dangerously knowledgeable, whether it be in health or education or transportation, anything, there's a reason that they are the reviewers. They have some sort of experience and expertise in that space, but it does not mean that we can assume any knowledge on their part. So when you're thinking about the data that you're about to gather and share in your federal proposal, and you're thinking about what do I already have and what do I have that I could use for context at the local, regional, or national level, what you're trying to put together then in a narrative format is a clear path, how you're getting from your initial description about what's happening in your community to your end destination, that next part of your formula. Here's what's happening in our community, and I'm going to help you get to the point where you understand why we are proposing what we propose. So point A is getting that reviewer started, reading and learning about your community. And our end point in our journey is that now they understand what's happening in this community. Therefore, what do I want to know? What's our action? What are we going to do to support the community? What are we going to do to address the need? Well, point A to point B sounds like a nice journey, doesn't it? A nice narrative flowing journey. The reality is that sometimes in very well-intentioned narratives, organizations will put in extraneous information, extra data that they think it might be helpful if the reviewers knew this or if they knew that. But what it feels like in that moment is that the reviewer who is on this road trip, on this journey, it's going to feel like they just took a very sharp left or a very sharp right. Go ahead and let me know with the reaction tool in the web platform here. How many of you have ever been out on a drive and your GPS system told you all of a sudden to make a left turn? Or in a quarter mile, turn right. And you think, wait, I thought I was going straight. Why did it make me turn? Has that happened to anyone else? It's happened to me when I am the driver. It has happened to me when I am in an Uber or a taxi. I'm like, why are we turning? Often it's got something to do with traffic or construction, an accident. But in those moments, especially if you are the one doing the driving, not being the rider, that is a jarring moment, and you wonder, "Why? Where am I going? Are we gonna get there okay? Am I gonna be late?" When our reviewers feel like they have had a sharp turn in the journey of learning about your data, it is equally jarring to them in their understanding of what you're putting forward. So as we think about the data that you might bring and put into your need statement, I'd like you to remember that we want our reviewers to have a nice, smooth ride as they learn about us. So what are we going to put into this need statement? You likely have way too much data to put into the need statement. In fact, I feel pretty certain that you as an organization have way too much data about your organization and your expertise, the community you serve, the needs that are there. It will not all fit into the need statement, nor should you try to make it fit. So how do we decide what we want to include? So what I have here are some prompts that you could use as a team, as an organization, to decide what are our basic answers to these questions, and then decide what is the best information that will help us put forward a clear butterfly, a clear main point for our reviewers to understand not just this issue at a national level, but the issue in our community. So one prompt you might try, what are the hurdles that your community is facing, your focus audience? It could be transportation. Does anyone have transportation as a barrier or as a hurdle that members of the community face in terms of accessing services or attending programs? Go ahead and let me know in the chat box. Y for yes, N for no. Do any of you have transportation barriers or hurdles that your community members are facing? Now, this is a very common hurdle or barrier, but it sounds really different if you are, let's say, in a very urban area where there's a lot of public transit, and there might be some sort of metro or train that you have access to, or it might be the bus system is available. Talking about transportation as a barrier is often going to be about distance to a public transit, either stop or station, or the barrier, the hurdle might be about the cost of the actual public transit. So those might be some of the ways that you talk about this barrier, this hurdle that you're brainstorming about. If we're in a rural community, and I myself happen to be based in a very rural community, um, I would have to drive 22.5 miles to get to the nearest public bus stop. And if you open an Uber app in my area, there's nothing, right? So transportation has a very different look in terms of a barrier or a hurdle than if we were in a more urban setting. So you might say, Diane, that makes sense, but why do I need to talk about it? Well, if your reviewer has only ever lived in urban or even suburban areas, they might really not understand. I know I didn't until I moved to such a rural community, how hard it is to get places if you don't have access to a reliable car, reliable transportation in that way. That biking in the winter is just really not an option when there's a foot and a half of lake effect coming down. You can't get to the doctor. You can't get to a program or service that way. So, because our reviewers have such different personal experiences, while they may sort of have an idea of what those hurdles or barriers might look like from one community to the next, we want to describe them as best we can so that it's like they have had that experience. So, another one of the prompts that we could use as we're trying to decide what data is going to be important is actually to look ahead to what do we think our success, our impact is going to look like. So, if we know where we're trying to get to, that would be like that end point of our journey. Where are we now? So, we're going to want to talk about our data for where are we now in our need statement, knowing that we're going to close the loop on our story later on in our application, talking about where we think we will end up, what we will achieve. Some other questions that you could ask yourself, your colleagues, your team as you're trying to decide what is it that you're going to prioritize including in your need statement. We talked about the barrier piece when I was using the hurdles. Either approach in terms of language could generate some great ideas for your team. Perhaps asking questions around where are there gaps in service. Was having a conversation about a behavioral health program the other day with an organization. And one of the things that they had identified as a gap was specifically for adolescents age 12. The way that the service categories were placed by the state and the way that their partnerships worked, they had clear lines for referral and linkages for 13-year-olds and then for 14 plus, but there was a gap in terms of what would happen if a 12-year-old came to them seeking service. So there might be some structural reasons within different, maybe the way that like state money flows and therefore like departments and agencies are providing services or something else structural that has created the gap. Maybe it's something that your organization hasn't had the resources to address yet. Different reasons we'll see those gaps come forward. But if that comes up as one of our discussion points, that gap that exists, something that we want to close the gap on in terms of our program design, what data do we have to show that it's a gap, to show that it's a need? That's what this particular question might bring forward. And again, we're trying to figure out what is the most important thing that we want our reviewers to walk away from the need statement with so that they understand what's happening in our community. Therefore, what are we going to do? What's the impact we're going to try and create? So that impact kind of flipping the prompt around one more time could be that we talk as a team. What solution, what impact are we trying to achieve? What is the hope that we're trying to convey to the reviewer? With this funding, we're going to be aligned with these federal policy goals that exist for why this money, why it is here and offered to us. But beyond that, what is it that we're going to create for solution? How can we give our reviewers hope and confidence that we can make a difference with our proposed work? So those prompts, they bring about dialogue and they give us some ideas, and maybe we have some structure for what that butterfly might look like. Maybe we've started to get a sense. Maybe it's the second butterfly, maybe it's the third of those three that we looked at. But how are we going to give it structure? How are we going to help our reviewers understand that we're experts and this isn't just our opinion, but this is data-based. This is factual. So on the screen, I have 5 different needs assessment processes and tools that organizations are frequently using to make their case, to prove their expertise, to say, this is not just our opinion. This is what we know. This is what we are experts in. So these 5 items, data analysis. So what sort of data do you already have access to about the clients you serve, the community members you support? Interviews and observations. So maybe some group interviews or some one-on-one interviews with those who have participated in the program, or maybe who have been identified as potential participants in a program if it was launched. You could also have focus groups. So maybe you've held a youth focus group trying to decide what other sort of harm reduction and prevention services and supports you might offer. So you might do focus groups with groups of individuals like those that you might serve in your project or program. Personas and use cases. So a persona is a conglomerate of the different demographic components that you might see. And so you might end up with some different, they're not true identities, but they are descriptions of what a participant might look like, what their background might be, what some of their concerns might be. And they help you to decide, well, how would this type of individual interact with our service? And so that's also then related to the idea of a use case. So what would it look like? How would someone interact with our service, and to think about the steps that they would take? Now, these 5 needs assessment processes and tools that are on the screen, I am not suggesting that you use all 5 in your needs statement. That would be the very complicated dot to dot butterfly that we saw, that number 1. That would likely be overly complex. I'm encouraging you to think about these processes and tools so that of everything that's available to you, you're thinking about what is best in this application situation. So what I'd love to hear is, which of these 5 is the most commonly used by your organization in terms of any grant application or confirming your next steps for a program or a project that you want to take on. Go ahead and let me know in the chat box if you would be so kind. Is it analyzing your own client data? Analyzing your own community data? Do you rely heavily on focus groups with your community members? There's no right or wrong answer, but understanding which one is going to be your first choice for where you're going to gather data and start to cite your data will help you to think about, how do I convey that main point? How do I convey and bring my reviewer into this key information that's going to help them understand our community? Great. Willie, I see that focus groups for you is one of the most primarily used processes and tools that you would have. So then what you could use, based on the data that's gathered from the focus group, this is how we know how it is not just our opinion about our community. Now, how could we give that a little context? What data source might we have at the state level? If we were talking about educational attainment for children at the local level, Maybe it was parent focus groups or teacher focus groups. At the state level, maybe we're using some state report cards, or maybe we're using Annie E. Casey Kids Count Data Book information because that's broken out by state. But then if we're trying to give it even more context, what would be at a federal level? How could we connect what we've learned through our own focus groups, or like in Ella's case, in their own data analysis? How could we then give it context at that larger national level? Well, maybe we would use some Department of Education studies, or perhaps there was a research result that came out from something the Hearst Foundation funded. So large primary source, well accepted data sources in terms of that national level. But so we're going to take the things that we know that are hyper local based on our needs assessment and process. We're going to give it maybe some regional and local context, give it some larger national context, and what we'll have is our butterfly. We want our reviewers to understand our one main point. Now, if you have any questions about the need statement, please do let me know. Certainly, we could talk more about citation structure. I always recommend that you follow your organization's citation structure as it relates to the data you're going to include in a need statement. My one generalized rule is to ensure you are citing your data. If it's your own client data that you have done the data analysis on, say so. If it is a focus group that you conducted, please let the reviewer know, was that done last month or 4 years ago? They're going to care a whole lot more if it was recent, right, than if it was 4 years ago. So don't make them wonder according to whom and how old is this data. Please be sure to tell them for your local data. And then for that other data you're using for context, please cite it using footnote if appropriate or in-text citation so that a reviewer is never left saying or thinking according to whom. If you have other questions about the need statement, by all means, please let me know. I'm keeping an eye on that chat box. And I want to then move into our next section. I want to move into the second part of our formula. We started with our problem. We were then going to think about our action. And our action is going to be laid out in part through our SMART objectives. SMART objectives fall underneath a goal, underneath a broad, intangible, abstract goal statement. So as we think about SMART and the acronym, what does this mean? What does it mean when we think about a federal proposal? I wanted to get that acronym on the screen as quickly as possible for you. SMART means specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. I would appreciate it on a scale of 1 to 10. 1, I'm learning about SMART objectives for the first time. 10, I love SMART objectives. I would take the mic if Diane would pass it. Go ahead and let me know how comfortable you feel with SMART objectives. Oh, Christy Beth, right in there with a 10. Oh, if I could pass the mic, I would. But so by all means, please really participate as much as possible in our upcoming exercise. We'd love to have you share your expertise. Okay, good. We've got a wide range of experience. So that's fantastic because the reason that this is the second topic within Federal Grants 201, here we are in more of kind of an intermediate conversation, is that this is a spot that many organizations are unfortunately losing lots of points. And why do I talk about points with federal grants so much? Because they're being scored almost like it was a test, right? And it is an incredibly competitive situation. So we don't want to lose a single point. Our team, it's not a joke, it's kind of just it's a statement of reality. 1 point can be the difference of $1 million or more, maybe a little less. But I mean, 1 point can make such a significant difference. So as we're looking at SMART objectives, I do make a pretty strong statement about it when we get into these intermediate classes because I'm going to acknowledge It is not, for most of us, our natural way of writing. It takes time and effort and usually multiple sets of eyes to create really strong SMART objectives in proposals. Part of why SMART objectives are so important is that this description of the work we're going to do, that second circle in that visual formula, the action we're taking, is being put forward in narrative structure, talking about, well, what is the goal of the work we're going to do of our project or program? We're giving some more understanding, filling in the answers to some of those journalistic basic questions using SMART objectives. And we very well are likely in a federal grant application to have the opportunity to put forward our work plan, to show more details about the activities that will help us get to the point where we achieve that goal. So I've brought along some examples to help us think about what is a SMART objective. So to do that, it's really important that we understand what is the program goal. So I've given us a program goal statement here that we're trying to increase family caregivers' understanding of how to manage difficult behaviors in those with Alzheimer's disease so they can remain in their home environment instead of long-term care. All right, so we have a broad, abstract, not tangible goal. We don't have all our details. If, as reviewers, we were dangerously knowledgeable, this was the space where we were appropriate to serve as a reviewer, and we moved on, what might we see in an objective that would leave us with some questions? Well, if this was the objective that we read in the proposal, 90% of family caregivers of those with Alzheimer's disease will participate in our education workshops. Pretend you're the reviewer. What questions do you have? Go ahead, let me know in the chat box, what questions do you have? There could be many. So we know that the goal, if we look back, our goal is to increase family caregivers' understanding of managing difficult behaviors. We have an objective that 90% of family caregivers will participate in our education workshops. But what questions might you have? What questions might you write in the margin as you consider what you have just read? Are you moving on and continuing to read the rest of the narrative? Or are you left with questions? How many family caregivers? Like the entire country? A state? A city? What are these education workshops? Are they evidence-based? Are they things you just created by yourselves as an organization? See how those, I have a lot of questions if I was the reviewer. I get it. I have an advantage. I knew what what the goal and the objective was, but I have a fair number of questions. If I have a chance to edit it, what might I want to focus on? Well, because the specifics and the measurable components are weak, there's some elements there, but we really need more. And there is no time-bound element. It's completely missing. It's really difficult to, as a reviewer, think about if this is attainable in the time we have available with the dollars we have available. And it's also very difficult to understand if it's relevant to the goal statement that I started with. So instead, maybe we provide some more detail. And so by the end of the calendar year, oh, there's a time element now. 90% of family caregivers utilizing the Alzheimer's Association Adult Day Program. Oh, okay, so it's a more narrow population of family caregivers. Will have participated in the Family Caregiver Education Series. Oh, interesting, it's capitalized. I wonder if it's like trademarked? Okay, but I've got some more specifics. And wow, they're going to self-report an increased understanding of how to handle difficult behaviors. Oh, interesting. Okay, so we also understand what it is that's going to indicate some success. Not saying it's perfect, but it certainly gave us a lot more. And as a reviewer, I have far fewer questions. The difference between the first and the second, it definitely could result in a higher score. The thing that we're trying to do is increase our confidence before we click submit. We're trying to think about how do we go from a well-intentioned, not fully smart objective to something smarter, to maybe the smartest objective we can write by using our colleagues, by using our team. And to do that, we want to help our team not only understand what a SMART objective is, but we want to help them understand what is the funding that we're applying in response to. Writing SMART objectives about your work in a vacuum or in a silo will help give you a good base. So you might have a starting point in terms of understanding the objectives for your program, for your work. But you need to think about what is the funding that I'm applying for. So the place where we start first is what is the purpose? What is the purpose for why this funding exists? And is there anything that I want to customize in my SMART objectives? I'm not changing my program design. I'm not changing who we are and what we do. But is there anything I want to change in terms of maybe my language choice related to the purpose of the funding? So that would be a first question we want to ask ourselves. And then the second thing is if they've got any additional outlining or detail provided around what they are setting forward for definitions of success. In this case, there were some clear expectations. This is SAMHSA, so health, health and human services, specifically substance abuse, mental health. But there was a specific section here in expectations that defined some terms. Linkage to care was defined, and retention was defined. Those are words that could be used slightly differently from one organization to the next. Now that's important. Why? Because as we get into then an example from that funding program, it's a little Monday quarterbacking here. We've got a funded example on the screen. Is it perfect? Certainly not. Did it get funded? Yep. So fun to use. And so what we have here are some of our words that were defined in the set of guidelines. Increase linkages. Oh, good, good. Okay, we understand that our reviewers have a very specific understanding of the word linkage. We also know they have a very specific understanding of the word retention. So as we walk through our example and we search for, here's what we've drafted, team. Let's see if we can find our specifics, right? Like literally we take teams and we go on a bit of a scavenger hunt. Let's find our specifics. What do we see? We see that some of our highlighted words shared some of those definitions from the guidelines. If we're looking for what's measurable, how will we know what we have achieved? What are the things that we're going to measure? Can we find any definitions of success for what is desired in terms of achievement with the funding program that would align with any of what is measurable? If we're thinking about what is attainable and we're thinking about our guidelines, there's two elements that I want you to consider. There is your stated program goal, and there is the stated goal, or in the case of that guideline, the purpose. Why does this funding exist? So is this attainable with the dollars we're going to have available and the timeline we're going to have available? Well, how much money is available in this set of guidelines? Is it $150,000 a year, $1.5 million a year? Is it over a 3-year period of time, a 5-year period of time? These are consistent across all the applicants. So the reviewers are considering, is this specific objective on the screen, is it attainable with the timeline and the budget that's available to all through this funding opportunity? They're considering, is it realistic based on the goal, based on that purpose in the set of guidelines? And lastly, the reviewers are thinking, when, within this very likely multi-year period of time, when is this actually happening? So we could have looked at this particular objective in a vacuum by ourselves with just this on the screen, and I could have asked for some language wordsmithing, and we still could do that. That certainly, I guarantee there are changes that we could make as a group, and then we'd say, oh, wow, yeah, that's better. We want to do that as our team before we submit because that's one of the things that helps us feel more confident before we go ahead and click that submit button. But this step that I'm talking about is not about editing from our perspective as those in the organization, but looking at our SMART objective and comparing it to what the guidelines say. Again, what definitions were present, what was the stated goal, purpose for that funding. So practicing our SMART writing, some of you were in the super comfortable space, and so you might not need this optional homework. For those of you who did not say or think, oh, yeah, I love writing SMART objectives. That's like one of my favorite work things to do. If that was not you, it's okay. That was not me for a long time. And I always love to team write our SMART objectives. Still, I think they come out so much stronger. But your optional homework is to work on writing SMART objectives, 2 or 3 maybe, for your current programs and services while you are not under the pressure of a federal deadline. When you're under the pressure of that federal deadline, you're worried about the budget and the memorandum of understanding and about this narrative section and that letter of commitment. And you've got so many things you're worrying about at the same time. SMART objectives will only be one of those many items. So if you can practice writing SMART objectives and have a base agreement as an organization or as a team, here are our key SMART objectives for this project or for this program. Then when the actual set of guidelines is released, you are ready to customize those to the specific set of guidelines the way that I just showed. So maybe you'd say, oh, I didn't in our draft, we don't use the word linkage. We use something else. Or we don't use the word consumer. We use the word client. But I see that these guidelines use the word consumer a lot. Huh. Oh, that doesn't change who we are and what we do. We're going to make that change in our SMART objective and surrounding language. So you can make some slight tweaks and modifications based on the guidelines. But again, optional homework, because it'll take some of that pressure off while that deadline clock is ticking. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask who's going to take on the optional homework. I can't assign homework for a 90-minute webinar, but what I can do is tell you that if you decide you want to practice writing SMART objectives and you're looking for input, someone to give you feedback on them, you can absolutely use my contact information that's part of these slides, and you can reach out and ask for feedback. Let us know you are in the session, and our team will happily provide feedback on what you've written. So that is a wide open offer for you as follow-up for today's session. Now, I did also put in a very quick little reference guide with some of the key phrases there, the terms, so that as you're thinking about that acronym for SMART, if you and your team decide you want to take on the challenge of drafting SMART objectives before the federal deadline clock is ticking, you would have this as a reference too. So I'm going to actually put forward 2 prompts. For those of you who are very comfortable with with writing SMART objectives, any comments, things you want to add to the conversation, any resources you want to add, would welcome them in the chat box. For others, broad, wide open questions about SMART objectives. One thing that I would suggest as an additional resource, and it is a free resource, which is always one of my favorite kinds, is the Kellogg Foundation has a fantastic resource site. Let me go ahead and put that link in the chat box for you. I didn't think to put that on a slide. But their resource section, it's got a lot of information about logic models and evaluation. And so it really is a nice resource also as we're talking about SMART objectives. So that might be a site that you'd want to check out at a later date. Okay, well, I'll keep an eye out to see if you have any questions that come up related to SMART objectives. But please do remember that we're here and happy to help if you've got questions that come up when you're practicing SMART objectives along the way. So now let's think about how we're structuring our application. I mentioned when we were getting started that federal grants are one of the few types of applications where you still will usually, often, but of course not always, have flexibility in terms of what it looks like and how you control your formatting. There are so many online portals being used these days that give you no flexibility in terms of formatting. It's become a different sort of game. But with federal grants, because we often get the opportunity to create a narrative and then upload it as part of the application structure, again, not always, but often, we really want to think about the presentation of our materials. Now, I've been doing this for so long that I used to have to worry about, were we binder clipping our materials? Were they in uh, three-hole punched binders? Were they in presentation folders? Were they bound materials? Let's not return to that. But to control our formatting so that we can upload a beautiful PDF narrative, yeah, that is something we want to take time with. So to get us started on this topic, I've got a quote from the author Cheryl Kate Tardif. Not a grant professional, not a federal reviewer, let's write an author. Because this is such important advice. Using white space helps the reader process the information in the work, gives our eyes a break, and keeps them interested. Look at each page as if it were a work of art. White space is highly underutilized in federal applications. So when we flip to this next screen, there's a lot of formatting happening here. We have the heading with an underline in bold. Within the first paragraph, we have two different phrases that are bolded. There is some white space, you're right, but then there's also bullet points being used. A lot of information there and well-intentioned, trying to use formatting to help our reviewers. But our reviewer is going to be uncertain. What is really the most important? If I'm going quickly, trying to look for something, my experience as a reviewer is probably going to be a little bit different than yours and my colleagues. So it's not that we're going to always have a uniform review experience because people digest information in different ways, but we're trying to ensure that it is as consistent as possible so that reviewers are not left searching for information because they usually don't have time to search. And we don't want them saying in their review summaries, could not find fill in the blank for the key thing they were supposed to find. So, let's actually scavenger hunt together for a moment, please. If you could, I'm going to pull up another screen. And could you please tell me which paragraph the goal statement is in? Which paragraph is the goal statement in? Is it paragraph 1, 2, or 3? Oh, I barely even had time to take a sip of water. The goal is there in paragraph number 2. I mean, perhaps y'all are that fast in terms of reading. But why, I think, instead of just your speed for reading, why were you able to so quickly tell me that the goal statement for this proposed program was in the second paragraph? I know, you're like, Diane, forehead slap. We get it. Because the sentence is structured with the phrase, the goal. And not only that, there's white space before it. Isn't that fancy? No, I'm being completely sarcastic. That's not fancy. That is very basic structure with white space. Now, if I have a high school freshman And I was helping. She'd asked me to read and provide some feedback on an essay she was working on recently. And I was thinking about how Mrs. Scales at Thousand Islands High School would feel about this very basic structure and seeing one sentence and then a hard return and then another sentence and a hard return. And I don't think that she'd be thrilled. So sometimes the structure we're creating in our grant application is not what we may have been taught and what we may have been focusing on in terms of beautiful writing and essays. But what we're writing instead, we are writing for clarity. We are writing for every point. We are writing to get funded. And we want it to be as clear as possible for our reviewers. So did we put huge, bold vision as a heading and goal as a heading to try and say, hey, funder, reviewer, don't miss me? We didn't go that far. But that super basic sentence structure and the hard return made it so that there was no reviewer who was going to say, I couldn't find the goal. If we had consolidated our vision and goal statements, maybe worse, even put the objectives into it and had that all as one paragraph to save a little bit of length in our overall limit, odds would be high that at least one reviewer would say they could not find the goal because it was buried within the text. Oh, like that is the most basic. It is so important though. I've stopped counting how many proposals I've reviewed over the 20 plus years. And that very basic idea will make it easier for me to review each and every time. Now, there's some other things that really help reviewers, and it's part of why they're built into structure. So many federal grants will require a work plan. I've got an example of one on the screen. Might ask you to type in your goal, your different activities, the timelines. It might also look like this as a template. So instead of typing out your timeline, you might put a dash or an X where the items would happen. Neither's right, neither's wrong. It's the funder's request for what they give you. There's other funders that don't give you a template at all, like SAMHSA. They just ask you to include some specific components. What the work plan is doing is making it easier for reviewers to digest and understand what are the key activities that you're going to undertake in order to achieve your big, broad goal and your SMART objectives. So we want to think about how easy is this for our reviewer to read. We don't want to make it the tiniest text possible just so that we can get everything in. We don't want to fill it with acronyms that make it difficult for our reviewers to understand what do we mean. This is a critical document that is helping to build on the understanding of our reviewers. And given that all of us learn and digest in different ways, it's as equally important to have it be clear and easily understood and digested as that basic narrative section that I just showed you. Now, there's still more. Our work plan is a visual element in the application. It might not be our design. It could very well be exactly what the federal agency has asked us to complete, but it is a visual. It is not paragraphs of text. We can, in many federal proposals, include some form of a visual. So on the screen right now, I have a bar graph that's showing us on the left-hand side comparative data for math, on the right-hand side comparative data for reading. And each of these bar graphs, wow, it does contain a lot of information, multiple grades compared to national averages over 2 periods of time. Can you imagine how long the text would be? It would be a pretty long description if this was just presented in narrative. But I think there's too much information in this particular visual. What I recommend, if you're going to include a pie chart, an infographic, a bar graph, please think about how to make it as singular in focus as possible. So by taking that image and cropping it, we've done away with, for the moment, reading. We're now only looking at math. So now I can have a labeled figure in my narrative that is just about these comparative math scores, and I can include that figure reference within the text where I'm talking about the comparative math scores. And then I could still use that reading image, but I would have it as a second labeled figure that I would reference in the narrative. Much easier for my reviewers to follow my train of thought and not to lose them along the way. Now, having fun in Excel or Google Sheets, using data, making graphs, that would be one approach. Another is at Canva, since it's free for nonprofits and tax-exempt organizations. That could be a way to create a very basic infographic that's singular in message. But I wanted to show you a few examples that you don't need to be fancy. What we want to do is think about visuals that help make it easier for our reviewers to digest. So to do that, I've got a very specific question that came out of a set of guidelines. They're asking, as do many, to identify your population of focus and to give all sorts of demographic information. That could be a pretty big narrative section, couldn't it? How do we make it easy without smushing all the sentences together? How do we make it easy for our reviewers to digest? Could be a basic table. This is a labeled figure. It is visual. It is easier for our reviewers to digest than if this was in basic sentence and paragraph structure. Similar idea. In this set of guidelines, the funder was asking for a chart or a graph depicting a realistic timeline. Now, they called it a timeline. Other agencies or departments at the federal level will call it a work plan, but the headings they have provided, the milestones, activities, responsible staff, start date, and milestone, is like a work plan. So slightly different language for the same idea. It is making the work visible, making it visual and easier for reviewers to digest than if we wrote probably, I don't know, I'm guessing it would be 2 full pages worth of description at a minimum if we had to write that out in sentence and paragraph structure. One more example of what might that look like. We've got another question and another set of guidelines. The unduplicated number of individuals you propose to serve, both annually and over the entire project period. So we're talking about a multi-year request, which is so common in federal grants. How are we going to make that clear for our reviewers? You guessed it, labeled tables. We've got a labeled figure number 3, number and types of services to be provided. We've got the gender of clients. We've got the sexual orientation of clients. And your reviewers don't have to go digging back in the narrative to say, wait a second, how many people were they going to serve in group counseling? What sentence was that in? Versus how many people are they going to support through case management? Quick, easy to reference, basic tables. I know, right? But this is the sort of thing, thinking like a reviewer, making it easier for your reviewer to digest. That is guaranteed to make you more competitive. Reviewers will not dig. That is not their job. They are not on a scavenger hunt. Their job, what they were brought on board to be a reviewer for, was to find the best program design to achieve the stated policy and program goals in that set of guidelines, but not to read between the lines, not to make assumptions. So whether you love the idea of being super competitive and going after all the gold stars, or in the case of the image on the screen, getting the fancy smiley faces, or I get it, right? That level of competition. Well, it wasn't me until I became a grant professional. And then I'm like, oh, at least in the professional space, turns out I'm super competitive because we put so much work into these proposals. On average, 100 people hours. We don't want to spend that sort of time if it's not going to be competitive, right? You want to have your time spent as wisely as possible. So if you have any questions on how to lay out your application on the visuals, by all means, please do share in the chat box. But I'm going to move into this broader conversation about a process that helps us understand, are we competitive or not? Some of the things we've talked about today, right? How do you facilitate getting the data and making decisions on main point? That's a broad process for your team. Might look a little different for everyone. How do you craft your narrative? What sort of visuals might you feel comfortable including? What might you have access to? That's going to be pretty different for each of you. This section on judging competitiveness, this is a tried and true process that you can use and implement regardless of whether you are an organization applying for your first or your 18th federal grant or your 118th. This process works each and every time and should be used each and every time. So the thing we have to consider is that the guidelines that are published by the Federal Department of Agency are called out by the Code of Federal Regulations. That's what this ecfr.gov is on the website. ecfr.gov is where you go to the Code of Federal Regulations. And what it tells us is that the government is required to put out information related to their funding opportunity. There is specific types of information that they must include in the actual announcement. So the announcement's different than the actual set of guidelines. But it can be different from agency to agency for the types of details. So we see that most sets of federal guidelines, we know they'll have a submission deadline. They'll tell us a little bit about eligibility. They'll tell us about activities and expenses that may or may not be eligible or ineligible. They have to tell us lots of details about how we submit and what portal or portals we use. There's going to be lots of legal text that's within there. But look at this second to bottom bullet. The review process is something that we want to find early on when we're reading the guidelines. So here's the approach that I take when I read a set of guidelines. Maybe, like today, the Assistance for Firefighter Grant Program opened for the year. So maybe that's what you're reading. Or maybe it's about, the other day I was reading one about a rural residency program for a healthcare system. Doesn't matter what the topic is. Maybe it'll be about some sort of capital sewer infrastructure tomorrow. But regardless of what type of funding you're reading about, when you read the federal guidelines, the first thing to look at is our work, what we want to do, our goals aligned with the activities and the program that's being requested or being allowed within these guidelines? Or is it going to make us change who we are? Because I might want to just put that down. I also want to make sure that the amount of money being offered seems at a very first glance to be appropriate. So I'm doing a very 30,000 foot overview on competitiveness. Then we're going to read it again. The second time we read it, this is when we're thinking about, do I share it with my colleagues? Do I share it with leadership in the organization? I want to make sure that I understand how we have to evaluate it. Do I have to have an external evaluation partner? Can we use our internal resources? Do I need to have collaborative partners? Do I need to have memorandums of understanding in place? Do we have the right partner network? Do we have the right structures in place? If I'm feeling confident at this point, it's probably appropriate to start the conversation for vetting it with the rest of the team, with the rest of leadership. But I'm not done reading the guidelines. Now, there's no judgment on whether you print them out and grab a highlighter and keep it on your desk for the next 60 plus days, or if you open the PDF and you do your highlighting there and make some notes in the different PDF tools. Everybody's got a different approach, but that RFP is not going to be far from you until you click submit. Now, because we've agreed, let's pretend that the organization has said, yes, we're going to apply. We really think this is going to be a good fit. Before we get to the point where we're going to click submit, we want to make sure that we have done everything possible to be as competitive as possible. So basically, we want to be the goldfish that has leapt to the bowl on the right. That's the goldfish that gets the perfect score. To my knowledge, I have yet to get a perfect score on a federal grant, but I have 2 colleagues that I know who have received perfect scores on federal grants. It is not a unicorn of grant scores. It is feasible. Highly difficult, but feasible. So maybe you're not the perfect score, but you're the top score. Also, amazing and a great accomplishment. What we're trying to find out is, did I do everything possible? I didn't leave anything out. I didn't leave out any of the basic items that would make me ineligible, because that is just, the saddest thing to have happen to an application. And also, am I sure that this application has been crafted, edited, and finalized with my reviewer and the review criteria in mind? Not my opinion, not the opinion of our leaders, not the opinion of our vice president of programs, but thinking about the reviewer. I'll explain why I make such a big deal about that statement in a minute. Well, how do we do that? We don't know our reviewers. But what we do know are how we're going to be judged. We know the process for review. And while I love this, is one of my favorite, now it's X, but it was Twitter at the time, favorite tweet ever released by grants.gov. Grant-making agencies are required to explain how an award will be evaluated. You can find this explanation in the FOA, though it is not always easy to locate. So don't give up. Go on a scavenger hunt. Read in the guidelines what type of reviewers they're putting on the panels. Read what the process is. Is it staff first and then peer reviewers? Is it peer reviewers, then executive staff? What is the process for how your proposal will be reviewed? What that sets the stage for is for you to implement a mock review. And this is the process that I was saying, whether it's your first, your 18th, your 118th, this process will statistically improve your organization's competitiveness over time. How do I know that? Because our team tracks what were our clients' competitive elements before, and by changing to mock review, they don't change who they are, they don't change their programs. Yes, we're great writers, but what do they change? We change one variable, we change mock review, and they see different results. And the reason, it's not just humble bragging about the writers. No, it is because of the change in going from the opinion of the editor to the opinion of the decision maker. So you still have to do grammar editing before you go to a mock review. You might call it a peer review, same idea. A mock review is taking the scoring criteria in a federal set of guidelines, identifying 3 colleagues or maybe family members, friends, people in a collaborative organization, someone that did not help write the application, and getting them to score the application, review and score it as if they were a reviewer. You're not asking them to spend days and days doing a review. You're asking them to spend an hour or 2 doing a review, but you're going to give them ample time on their calendar to complete it. What happens is that you get back their scores. And just like they were real peer reviewers for that federal agency, you take the average. You're going to look at your overall average and you're going to look at your average by section. Gee, I got nearly a perfect score on the needs statement. I had that one main point. Everybody could see the butterfly, no problem. All right, I mean, it'd be nice to get a perfect score, but I got a 14 out of 15 in this theoretical example. Gosh, how did I do? Budget narrative, I lost 4 points. And the evaluation section, I lost 3. I'm going to focus my efforts on editing those first to try and get back some points, and then maybe I'll polish the need statement last to try and see if I can do anything to get that last point. So it also helps to focus your final edits before you submit, but again, from the eyes of the decision maker, your theoretical stand-in decision maker, than the opinion of an editor. A very well-intentioned, often with a fierce red pen editor, but that is not going to help make us competitive in the process. Now, I do need to give you a few bits of advice. This process does mean you need to think about having a little bit of preparation personally if you were the one who did the writing. Being scored by others in your organization or in your network or family and friends is something that takes significant psychological safety. It feels risky to put your work out there and say, please score this candidly. Please do not sugarcoat it. Please, please, I want your candid feedback. So you need to prepare yourself and say, I'm not going to take the comments personally. They're trying to make, we're just making the work better. But because we know we're going to get feedback, they're not going to be all perfect scores. We want to make sure we set aside some time to incorporate the feedback. Now, mock review. In fact, our team, we were running 3 consecutive mock reviews at the end of last week. There's a lot of stuff happening with state grants these days, it seems. And so we don't just do this process for federal grants. Remember, I said some of what we learned today was going to be applicable not just to federal grants, but to others. We do this process with any grant where the scoring criteria is known, which means state, county, and city grants are also great candidates for mock review. However, whether city, county, state, or federal, mock review certainly is never a guarantee that we will get every point and that we will absolutely get the award. No such guarantee exists. And part of the reason is that we cannot control the strength of those other applications in the process. We cannot control any relationships that may exist at the personal level, professional level, elected officials, right? We can't control any of that. We certainly cannot control how well our reviewers may understand something related to our subject matter. And there are often priority and bonus points. So things that are uh, really a basic yes or no. One example was just looking at a volunteer firefighter grant, and the grant criteria was you got extra points if you were covering a county instead of only one municipality. Well, if you're not covering a whole county, it's a factual yes or no. You're not going to get the bonus points. You still could get a perfect score with all of the basic points, but you wouldn't get the bonus points. Or was looking at a prevention framework grant recently that was looking at prevention of substance use disorder, and the bonus points were about how you demonstrate a specific level of at-risk individuals in your anticipated population you're going to work with. It's factual based on the data that is available and agreed upon for a community. So the reason I highlight that is that you can do everything possible to get every point, but mock review nor your hardest efforts will not result in changes of priority and bonus points being assigned. It's not like extra credit back when we were perhaps in school and your extra time on an assignment or reading something extra, filling out an extra worksheet would get you extra credit. These are not those types of points. These are outside of our control. They're based on something factual. So unfortunately, mock review will never influence that. And if you're against proposals that are getting all of the priority and bonus points, it is very hard to be competitive. So just something to be aware of because, like I said, mock review unfortunately can't change that. But it does change proposals for the better each and every time we go through the process. And so part of why we're going through the process and putting every application through is because you want to feel competitive when you click submit. You want to know that you did everything you could to get your best score so that your hard work and the hard work of your team results in a grant award. But there are a few other things to consider. Now, you're right. I just got on the soapbox. You might not get funded. You did the mock review, you listened to my advice, and you didn't get funded. But there's still things to be learned. So if you get denied, please ask for your scores, ask for your feedback so that you can find out where your reviewers thought your proposal could be stronger. Did they say that they had questions about the data you used in your needs statement? I certainly hope not after today's conversation. Do they have questions about your SMART objectives? I'm thinking that's not going to be it because you'll have practice. Some of you are already really comfortable. Maybe they had some questions about the length and the strength of your partnership with community partners, right? So maybe they're asking questions like that, but learn why is it that you got the score you did so you can think about how to improve. And because I strongly believe that we learn from our successes, right? We want to repeat that success. We want to make it a repeatable process, a repeatable experience. It's not only about learning from failure. When you get funded, please ask for your score. Of course, after you do your happy dance and celebrate that you got the grant, but please ask for your scores. See what comments they gave you. See what positive feedback they gave you. You want to replicate that each and every time. They may also give you some constructive feedback. You may not have gotten a perfect score and you might learn some nuggets. We got funded, comma, but, ooh, this reviewer made a good point. Next time I'm going to make this stronger. There will still be things for you to learn. I'm really curious, has anyone here, whether for a federal grant or any sort of grant, asked for feedback after they have been funded? Why for yes in the chat box if you have done that before. That is an intermediate to advanced move for sure. And it's not something to do only for federal grants. You can do it with foundations as well. We are so excited that you have awarded us funding. Thank you so much. Would really love to understand what resonated with your reviewers. If you could provide that feedback with us so that we can be sure to take the same, a similar approach in the future or, continue to learn from that and replicate. Like ask foundations, ask state agencies, ask federal agencies. Definitely a pro tip for, like I said, that's an intermediate to advanced step to take. And it'll help you replicate your success moving forward. Now, what does a mock review actually look like? Such a good question. Literally different each and every time. Today, I was building a mock review template with the team, and it was for a state grant in Colorado. Very different than the one that had been built yesterday for that volunteer firefighter grant that I just talked about. And the reason they look different, one looked kind of like what's on the screen here. The other was a table with the maximum number of points available and then the points awarded. The reason that they look different is because it should be as lightweight for you to create as possible. It should be based on what's in the guidelines. Don't spend a lot of time and effort creating fancy review things. You want it to replicate what is likely being presented to your reviewers and get as quick and meaningful feedback as you can from your colleagues. I could talk about competitiveness and mock review all day. I really could. And I know that makes me unique, but I find mock review to be one of the standout things that highly successful and sustainable organizations do, whether they call it mock review or something else. If you see organizations not just applying all the time, but getting a lot of government funding, they have a final review process in place like this. That's what's making them feel confident as they click apply each and every time. So I would be happy to entertain any final questions that you have in the chat box, but of course I am absolutely happy to answer questions you may have afterward via email. I'll type my email into the chat box as well, and you can see it on the screen now. It's diane@dhleonardconsulting.com. There you go. It's in the chat box too. You also, if you say no thank you to email, I have plenty in my inbox. I do understand. No hard feelings. You're welcome to always reach out via our other support mechanisms. Could be on LinkedIn. You could leave a comment on YouTube. Wherever you want to ask for help or ask a question is where my team and I are absolutely happy to continue to help support you. And I want to say thank you for being with me, participating throughout the session in the chat box. Really appreciate that. I'm scrolling back. I don't see any outstanding questions related to the topic today. But by all means, once again, please do reach out if you have additional questions. Maybe it's the next time you're working on a federal draft. Maybe it's when you're debriefing with your team after today's session. Maybe it's when you download the handouts and you're taking a look back at some of the examples I gave or the different analogies. But whenever and wherever it is, I'm here to help and help take the stress out of grants for you. So thanks again for joining us. And Brooke, thanks again for being our facilitator.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Diane, for this incredible presentation. Your passion for all of this really just leaps off the screen. I know everybody learned a lot. I'm going to go ahead and launch the webinar feedback survey for everybody. If you could please take a moment to go ahead and complete that for us. It helps us to know what's working well, what maybe needs some tweaking, and we can give Diane some feedback as well for how awesome this presentation has been. Yes, there will be a recording of the webinar. We will post our recordings to our website within 48 hours of the end of the webinar. So you'll see that here in a couple days. Again, if you guys could just take a moment to complete the survey, it helps us. Feel free to be as candid as you would like. It is an anonymous survey. We hope you guys can join us for our next webinar. That is going to be this Thursday, same time, sorry, I almost said same place, but it'll be a different webinar. This one's going to be on 4 steps to effective training. This is actually part 2 of a 2-part series. That recorded webinar is available as well on our website. This one will be with Lisa I. Perez. Registration's free, as always. And you guys can access this and any of our other recorded webinars online on our website. If you go to nativelearningcenter.com, there's a CAFETA webinars section. And in there, there is a recorded webinars portion. So you can click on any of the webinars that we've done for the past 2 years. Those stay up. So feel free to view them, share them with your friends and your colleagues. And please also check out our upcoming events posted to our various social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. We even have a podcast titled Hopathanga Native American Podcast, where we discuss more focused topics within Native American housing and self-determination. You can listen to that on Simplecast, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, as well as viewing the video recordings with our guests on YouTube. All right, folks, once again, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to connect with you again really soon. Thank you again, Diane, for such an incredible presentation.